time for our webinar to start. And so again, I'm Dave Harmon with the George Wright Society. Thank you all for being here, but I'm going to turn it over to Chris Barr of the National Park Service, Reconstruction Era National Historical Park. Chris is going to moderate. I will then turn my camera off and mute myself and just stay in the background. Chris, please go ahead and introduce yourself more fully and go ahead and kick off the webinar. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Dave. As said, my name is Chris Barr, and I'm the Chief of Interpretation at Reconstruction Era National Historical Park, located in Beaufort County, South Carolina. We're a fairly new-ish national park. We're just created in January of 2017, and we're kind of a unique national park. Our job is to tell the story of the Reconstruction era everywhere in the United States, but we sort of use what was happening here in Beaufort as kind of a case study in that. So one of the exciting things about this park and my job is to, we get to talk about national parks everywhere else and their Reconstruction connection. So we're really excited to be here and participating with this panel, which is entitled "Extinguishing the Campfire Myth: New Scholarship on the Reconstruction Era and America's National Parks." So real quick, just, one of the as you no doubt gather by the title there, we're exploring new scholarship, and as me, I don't necessarily create a whole bunch of scholarship. I just read historians' work like these folks and get excited and tell everybody about it. And so with that being said, I'm going to hand things off here to our other panelists and let them each take just a couple of minutes to introduce themselves, their work, and then we'll start diving in. And this is going to be a very, very informal kind of Q&A conversation kind of piece. So let's dive in. We're just going to go, I guess, kind of from the top left on my screen, which is Adam. Adam, do you want to go on and introduce yourself?
Sure. Thanks so much, Chris. I am Adam Dean. I am Department Chair and Associate Professor of History at the University of Lynchburg, formerly known as Lynchburg College. We're a small liberal arts school here in Lynchburg, Virginia. And I teach both 19th century U.S. history, classes on slavery, the Civil War, and Reconstruction. And I also teach environmental history. And my research is really at the intersection of those two fields. And starting this July, I'll actually be moving to New Mexico with my family to transition to working in education at Valles Caldera National Preserve, which is a relatively new NPS unit established in 2015.
We're going to get you a hat and everything. It's going to be exciting. Next time we do one of these, we're going to make you wear your hat. So very cool. Well, thank you, Adam. Looking forward to hearing more from you, and looking forward to maybe our paths crossing in the green and gray one day. So Megan, why don't you go on and introduce yourself next here?
Sure. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us. I am Megan Kate Nelson. I am a historian and writer living outside Boston. I began my career as a historian as a Southernist and an environmental historian, and then I kind of switched gears and came west for my previous two books, The Three-Cornered War and Saving Yellowstone. So I think I'm only one of a handful of people who has done both Southern and Western history. There is, and of course, it's the tie that binds all of the work that I've done is an attention to natural and built landscapes. And so I've always been interested in places like parks, city parks and national parks, and, landscapes that are contested, are claimed at different points by different people, and what all of that means, and the kind of interesting conflicts in that history. So I am happy to be here. This originated because Rolf reached out to me because he too has been writing about parks and about trying to think really seriously about how we can bring the history of national parks and then also other kinds of parks to Americans, when for the most part, especially in the big nature parks or in something like Central Park in New York, the natural environment kind of overrides everything. And we often are led to think that these natural spaces do not have histories before they became parks or afterward. So so with that, I will hand it over to Rolf.
Great. Well, thank you, Megan. Rolf Diamant. I am here in Woodstock, Vermont. I am a adjunct associate professor at the University of Vermont in history, but my career was with the National Park Service. So I'm very happy to hear Adam is coming to the service. Our gain. My time was spent mostly in the management of national parks, but more lately I've worked in the history of national parks. I am also, like Megan, a writer and historian, and most recently with my co-author Ethan Carr wrote a book, Olmsted and Yosemite, which really looks at the larger impact on the of the Civil War on the creation of the National Park Service or system, and changes to America, which enabled public lands to grow and to be set aside for the Commonwealth. So anyway, I'm very happy that the three of us with Chris are able to come together this afternoon in doing research for my book. I was hugely impressed by the work of both Adam and Megan. It's fresh scholarship and needs to be shared.
Oh, very cool. Thank you, Rolf. So let's kind of dive in and talk a little bit about national parks and Reconstruction. So I know, Megan, I know you've heard me say this before, but as a fairly new national park site here in on the coast of South Carolina, we would occasionally, and it happens periodically, we get visitors that'll come in and they'll kind of be walking down the street behind me. They'll see that big Arrowhead logo up on the building, and they'll kind of walk in and they'll say, "Is this a national park like Yellowstone?" And my bad joke I always say is, no, Yellowstone's a Reconstruction park like us. And so, I think a lot of people don't necessarily think about, Reconstruction as being, sort of tied to national parks. Most people kind of think about Reconstruction as being, well, they sort of take one of two tracks. They're either sort of taking a more dated view and, sort of the old Dunning school and saying, oh, it's just this period of corruption and all that kind of stuff. Or they're taking a little bit more of a newer, more progressive view and saying, well, it's this process of emancipation. But for neither of those groups, national parks don't usually fit into the narrative. So, you know what, I'm gonna do something kind of dangerous and just sort of throw it open to all three of you guys to, based on your work, kind of make the case, why are the sites that you work on, why do you see them as Reconstruction sites? We'll see who's going to jump in first here.
I'll go ahead and do that.
All right.
Well, I mean, this was really interesting to me when I started researching for the Yellowstone book. I had written The Three-Cornered War, where I was basically asking the question, what happens when we think about the Civil War from an unexpected place, right? Which is the desert Southwest. And so when I was researching Yellowstone, I was like, well, what if we think about Reconstruction from an unexpected place, right? Yellowstone, and I think part of, and I'll see if Adam and Rolf agree with me. I mean, part of the issue that we've had in sort of making this case before this point is that the fields in history are so siloed that if you are a Civil War or Reconstruction historian, you are almost always talking about the Southeastern Theater in some sort of capacity. You are almost always in Reconstruction studies talking about the South, about political Reconstruction there, and about Black civil rights. And this is all wonderful work, and we can see why this is happening, right? But what that means is huge parts of the nation and many other different populations are sort of left out of that story. And because Yosemite and Yellowstone are these first two kind of big moments, as Adam talks about in his book, Yosemite in this Civil War moment that no one ever thinks about. No one ever thinks about the Homestead Act and the Pacific Railway Act and Yosemite happening during the Civil War and passed by Lincoln's Congress, and when you point that out to people, I think, and Adam, you must have this experience too, people are like, and must be like, Chris, your visitors, where they're like, head sort of explodes, right? Like, what? Because we're not, historians don't think in these terms. And also I think Americans in general don't think in these terms of sort of bringing these two things together. Like, what if we think about Reconstruction in the West. Now, not all parks obviously are in the West, but the examples of Yosemite and Yellowstone sort of allow us to think about the Civil War and Reconstruction in new ways.
Okay, cool. Adam, you want to kind of tackle that from sort of a Yosemite perspective a little bit? Like kind of what's
Absolutely.
What's the thought
So
there? Yeah.
I completely agree with Megan, even down to the conferences that historians go to, like the Southern Historical Association. People dress differently and it's a different crowd than the American Society for Environmental History, some more Patagonia and hiking boots. In all seriousness, though, so much of the historiography or the books that historians write about Reconstruction has this north-south dichotomy. And even, Eric Foner's very famous book on Reconstruction, which is a fantastic book, far better than anything I could write, but it has very little on the American West. And, what I talked about in my book, both with Yosemite and Yellowstone, is not only that the creation of these parks is tied to the politics of the Civil War and Reconstruction, but so is the opposition to them. So there's a myth out there, and Megan wrote in the Washington Post about this, that no one opposed the creation of Yellowstone. And to a lesser extent, that myth is talked about with Yosemite, and that's just not true. The same person and people, Cornelius Cole of California and George Julian of Indiana, were very much opposed to the creation of Yosemite and Yellowstone. And they framed their objection not kind of in a modern environmentalist way, but they wanted the land reserved for small farmers. And both had a long career of promoting the Homestead Act and free or cheap land to settlers in the West, and in the case of Julian, land redistribution in the American South. And so they both saw the creation of nature parks as a threat to that vision for the American West, which was intimately tied with what's going on in the Civil War and Reconstruction.
There's another context here too that we probably shouldn't overlook. And if we sort of take it from Adam's perspective and go a little bit 20,000 feet higher, the larger opposition to national parks or to a public use of government-owned lands, and most of those lands, of course, were taken by force from Native Americans. The opposition was for many years those who worked in the interest of slavery in the United States, who had political power in Washington and had no interest in any purpose for public lands beyond their sale to pay for the limited government they had. This was pre-personal taxation, when those powers, that elite, did not want to see personal taxes because they would have to pay some tax on the chattel slavery that were working on their labor farms. So there was entrenched opposition just to the concept of diverting any lands for public purposes. And if the war had not been fought, there's no telling how long that opposition would have lasted in the United States.
Yeah, because a big part of it too was federal overreach, right? Like this idea, particularly among Democrats, that any of these kinds of policies that involved the federal government kind of extending its power anywhere, whether it was the South or the West, and taking land, that was verboten, right? Like this is something they were very definitely opposed to. And those two ideas, the sort of resistance to federal overreach, and then also this idea that that Adam was talking about with, the land belongs to the people and they should be able to develop it however they want. This is the kind of core idea behind the American dream. It's the core idea behind Manifest Destiny. These are still with us today, right? Like these are still kind of percolating around. I mean, and I think this is also something that people don't think about very much is that, I think most people assume national parks are a public good and they're great for everybody. And why would you ever get rid of them? But we've seen quite recently that there are people who would not mind getting rid of them and have actually taken steps to do so. And so these are arguments against parks that are still with us today. And I think it's important to know that history. But it's one of those things, Rolf, you wrote about this in the shorter piece that you wrote with Ethan about the campfire myth. That's kind of a theme uniting all of our work, and then also the subject or the kind of title of today's webinar. But the utility of the campfire myth is that it obfuscates all of that disagreement, right? Because it's just a bunch of guys around a campfire agreeing that parks are great, right? And that there's no kind of sense either in that story or in the story of Teddy Roosevelt and John Muir, no sense of the opposition and no sense that parks are created by legislative action and executive action. It's a deliberate choice that people make, and it involves funding and it involves infrastructure and it involves all these kinds of things. And there are going to be people who are opposed to that, and there have been in the past. But the great usefulness of the campfire myth is we can just ignore all that and think, these are wonderful spaces that everyone loves.
It also is useful to completely ignore Reconstruction and the role of Reconstruction in this whole story. Ethan and I wrote about the convenience of that lapse of memory at a time when people just wanted to forget the war. And in particular, during the ascendancy of white supremacy and Jim Crow at the turn of the century, these myths were very useful to take agency away from those who were involved in significant changes during the Civil War and the Reconstruction era, and place the creation in the hands of just a handful of intrepid explorers in the West. Mm-hmm. It was a story that sold well.
Oh, absolutely. And Adam, I'm wondering what you think in terms, both you and Rolf, in terms of Yosemite, because it's an interesting case, right? Because it's not quite federal overreach. It's the federal government giving, initially, at least in '64, it's giving the land of the state to the state of California to manage. It's still government, it's government action, but it's not quite the same as Yellowstone, which is of course how those two pieces of legislation differ. They're slightly different kind of in how they're going about setting aside these places. But then Yosemite becomes a national park in 1890, right? So but that's a very different moment. That's a post-Reconstruction moment. So I wonder how much of Yosemite's kind of early history is actually erased in the public consciousness, that we focus instead on the 1890 moment and on Muir and Roosevelt, and not on either the Civil War context or the connection between Yosemite and Yellowstone.
So I just got booted off, so I
welcome back.
Rude.
Yeah, it happens. I didn't quite hear the end of Megan's question, but I think I got the gist of it. So what's interesting about Yosemite in 1864 is that it's taken from the federal domain and given to the state of California to manage as a nature park. And there's some evidence from the historical record as to why they decided to do that. One of which is they assumed that no white person had settled it yet and had preemption claims. A few of the people who were involved in the legislation knew that wasn't true, but that wasn't known in Congress writ large. And then, people were talking about California should have the right as a state to manage it. And a big claim that I make in my book is that California's mismanagement of Yosemite, which is not entirely their fault, but nevertheless it was perceived as such, was one reason why, the federal government created Yellowstone as a national park.
And there's direct testimony, Megan, you're probably familiar with this, both you guys, in Congress during the debate on Yellowstone. This preemption issues before the Supreme Court. And I think it's maybe Senator Pomeroy, but someone says, one of the sponsors says, basically, we've seen what's happened with these claims in Yosemite, and essentially the failure of the state of California to resolve it. We don't want this to happen, to repeat itself with Yellowstone.
Yeah, and there was a Supreme
it's
Court
going to be
case.
the responsibility of the national government. Is that Adam? Is that track with your?
Absolutely. Yeah, you couldn't have said it better. And there was a Supreme Court case called Hutchings versus Lowe that really dealt with these two preemption claims in Yosemite. And it was national news, and certainly aware, everyone creating the Yellowstone legislation was aware of it. And what James Hutchings and forget the other guy's first name, they had preemption claims in Yosemite. And preemption essentially was if you go onto unsurveyed federal land, when that land becomes available for sale, you have the first right to it at a pretty cheap price and 160 acres. And the crux of what Hutchings was arguing is that by making improvements and development on his land and elsewhere in Yosemite Valley, that he acquired some sort of protection for his preemption claims. And the court decided against him and essentially said that you only have a preemption right once the land becomes available for sale and once you've completed that sale. And because the federal government never put the land for sale, your preemption claim doesn't apply.
I might add one more thing about Yosemite, and at the risk of stepping into the great argument, which was the first, what's the first national park? Which Y park deserves that credit? Yosemite has to be looked at in the context of the Civil War. It was in the midst, its creation was just literally weeks before a national election, where Lincoln was running hard with a lot of opposition. And there was, I think, enough voices of at least the California Republicans that wanted something to be done with this land, that he certainly was more than inclined to sign the legislation and support it. But it was also, you have to look at Yosemite also in the context of other parks, created in that general period, like Central Park. Central Park was a statement of defiance, if you will, to this Southern perspective of, blocking all investments in large-scale public works. It was the largest Central Park at the time. It was being finished about the same time Yosemite was being legislated. Was the largest project of its kind in the United States. And it was this departure from this Southern democratic ideology of small government, limited government, as you were describing, Megan, not unlike some of the arguments were some of the controversies and tensions of our day, that just didn't want government to act on behalf of the population at that scale. And so it was like Central Park, it was an act of a major departure from everything that had happened previously. And in keeping with other actions, and all, I would like to point out, all in the wake of emancipation. That emancipation, the ending of slavery, was the linchpin for this complete overhaul of government and its purposes.
Yeah. So if I can kind of chime in here, because we've actually got a great kind of question that's kind of popped up that does tie in a little bit to what we do here in Beaufort at Reconstruction America National Historical Park. One of the core stories that we talk about is sort of this idea of redistribution of land in court cases and who has the right to buy this land. And kind of the slightly oversimplified way we explain it is, that Lincoln didn't consider the Confederates to exist. Like secession isn't legal. You're just U.S. citizens who have abandoned your properties, delinquent on your taxes. So now they're selling off all this farmland all over the coast of South Carolina. And so kind of thinking in that vein, and I'll admit I had not thought about it this way, but we've got a question that popped up. And I'm just going to kind of read the whole question. It says, according to Gary Willis, Lincoln is a strong federal constitutionalist, so he refused to negotiate with the Confederacy as a state. And so instead, he considered the Southerners to be rebels engaged in rebellion. So given this position, why do you think Lincoln is willing to make a relatively radical move and give Yosemite to California? So, if part of this whole idea of property redistribution during the Civil War is, well, who has the right to this land? Is the government giving it away? Is it selling it? What do y'all think is kind of going through for you Yosemite folks? Kind of what's going through, what do you think is going through Lincoln's head here?
The answer is we don't know. So I tried really hard, as have many other historians. I mean, Lincoln's one of the most written about people in American history, to find out what he was thinking when he signed this thing. And the answer is there's no written down comments or public speeches to the effect at all. And so it's all, frankly, conjecture. I think that California was her reliable Republican state. The John Kness was the California senator who introduced it. Was probably some bigger fish to fry with Jubal Early being near the Capitol. And so seeing that California was interested in it, that there were, very politically elite and powerful, guys in the Republican Party in favor of it, might take, without any evidence from Lincoln himself, as he just signed it.
Okay. Very cool. Well,
and
yeah,
if Rolf doesn't have anything, because I know, he's also an expert on Yosemite as well. And I am not as much, but I think that's such an interesting question. The federal government had always reserved, and still does reserve, the right to do anything they want with federal land, right? And any land that they deem take from either states or territories or native nations, and declaring it as federal land, right? Most of the time what they're doing is surveying it in order to sell it. And what we do know about Lincoln is that he was very much a proponent of the white settlement and development of the West, and increasingly the Black settlement of the West. He supported the Homestead Act. He supported the Pacific Railway Act. He talked in all of his State of the Unions, or wrote, they weren't actually spoken, but he wrote in all of those about what he considered to be the positive developments of mining and agriculture and exploration, and all of that kind of leading to settlement. And I think one of the things that we don't talk about often enough in Civil War and Reconstruction history is the extent to which the Republican Party and Lincoln himself were thinking about the future, right? They were thinking about a time after the Civil War. They were thinking about what was going to happen to the nation and where that was going to happen. And I think for them, the West became this place of the future, and it became a place that could potentially unite the North and the South, and bring them back together and give them something kind of to believe in. And, natural wonders had long been a part of that conversation. Niagara Falls, the Natural Bridge in Virginia, Arkansas Hot Springs was, you could make that argument that was the first, right? Because it was a preserved space designated as such by the federal government under Andrew Jackson. And So there was already that kind of ethic, like not only this kind of cultural surge of what Rolf is talking about, this sort of with parks and with natural spaces, that these are valuable to us, and they're valuable to us not only as people for kind of health and sanity in a time of growing industrialization, but also important as a site of American citizenry, right? Like that, this is where we are going to demonstrate kind of who we are. And that kind of emerged in this moment in the time before the Civil War as this kind of ideology of nature's nation, this idea that the United States may not have like abundant, ruins like Europe to sort of demonstrate how long its history is and how exceptional the United States is as a nation, but it does have huge mountains and waterfalls and places like Yosemite. It has Half Dome, right? So like there is this impulse kind of on the ground and then also in Congress to really value those kinds of spaces as symbolic places.
And they were particularly symbolic during the war.
Yeah.
Where north is, the parts of the country where the United States was under attack. They wanted, Megan's absolutely right. They wanted to begin to construct a vision for what the future would look like. And you have to remember the war was hugely contested in the northern states. Lincoln had to, as I said, go through a very difficult re-election campaign. And the argument had to be made that the country was going to come out of the war a better country than it went into the war. In other words, there was enormous sacrifice being called for in terms of blood and treasure. And there had to be some evidence that there was the country was gaining something important. And as Megan says, it was gaining places. It was, things like the Olmsted Act at least held out the promise of settlement at the expense of Native Americans, but that was a constituency that Lincoln was very conscious of, white settlers, and but also to win the war, he needed to offer a vision of a United States that was better in many different ways. It was going to be better because it was finally going to resolve the issue of slavery and its borders. It was going to be better because it was going to, it was going to be a modern state. It was going to have a pension bureau. It was going to have, a rudimentary welfare system, the Freedmen's Bureau. It was going to have also a modern revenue and taxation system. And schools. It was going to have land grant colleges, and it was going to have some public parks.
Mm-hmm. And I think it was also helpful. Yeah, I mean, I think it was also helpful for everyone who is promoting Yosemite and then later Yellowstone to argue that actually these sites of natural wonders are useless otherwise, right? So, in the debate over Yellowstone, when the objection comes up that, well, aren't people going to want to develop this land? And I think Henry Dawes from Massachusetts says something like, psst, like, who's going to live in this place? It's like, are they going to live on the side of Half Dome? Like, I mean, they just, it's kind of a snarky response. Like no one, either native or white, is actually going to be able to produce anything in this place. Like they're not gonna be able to ranch it or mine it. And they didn't think they would be able to mine it. They're not gonna be able to farm it. So we might as well, right, take it out and give it to the people as this natural space. And that rhetoric of uselessness kind of comes into play a lot. Like, oh, nobody lives there, including Native people, like, which was not true. And so we can just take it fully out of production because no one's going to produce it anyway. So I think that's partly an answer to that question, how Lincoln was thinking about Yosemite perhaps differently from, a place like Eastern Colorado or Western Nebraska, like where you could see how those lands would become agricultural in nature.
Okay.
Just
Well,
to
very
add
cool.
one,
Yeah, go for it, Adam.
just add one more thing. Part of the vision behind nature parks, as expressed by Frederick Law Olmsted in his preliminary report, is that these were supposed to be available to everyone. And he contrasted that with what was going on in Europe at the time, where if you wanted to see, the beautiful highlands of Scotland, it's all under private ownership. And that part of the meaning of Northern and United States victory in the Civil War is, if we manage our public lands in these ways, this is what democracies do. And they looked at other sites at the time, specifically Niagara Falls comes up a lot, that, this place is kind of becoming a dump because it's under private ownership, and we need to prevent Yosemite and then Yellowstone from becoming another Niagara Falls. That's not just with Olmsted, but within the press, that's kind of a common cultural reference. We can't let it turn into Niagara.
Okay. Well, very cool. Thank you, Adam and Rolf and Megan there. So we've got an interesting kind of series of questions and responses kind of starting to pop up in the chat that all kind of tie into what I actually kind of wanted to dive into next. And that is sort of, what does all of this look like on the ground in the national parks today, right? Like, so I'm an interpreter. For those of y'all that are not familiar with Park Service lingo, that means basically I'm a storyteller with the Park Service. I led a tour this morning, like with the public. So thinking about this, and then here come the jets. Hopefully that's not too loud. Thinking about some of this conversation about our national parks as reconstruction sites. How do you all envision, say, like national park sites beginning or continuing, as it may be, to talk about this kind of stuff? You're that field interpreter, like Adam. You're getting ready to be out at Valles Caldera. You've got that family that walks up. They're sort of enamored with this sense of space and wonder. And how do we as interpreters within the Park Service talk about this in the context of Reconstruction? And so we've got a couple of people have asked various versions on that question. How do you convey the complexities of all of this? We've got a deputy superintendent from Yellowstone is kind of chimed in the chat to say, that they're updating stories to be more inclusive and accurate, and made a note to talk about Native American involvement and tribal consultation in some of this storytelling. So kind of thinking about you guys as sort of scholars, and in the case as a future NPS interpreter and as a former NPS interpreter, kind of what do y'all think interpretation on the ground looks like, thinking about Reconstruction in a national park?
Well, I'll just say,
question.
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I'll just say, hi, Mike. It's exciting to see you here. I met Mike last year at a science conference at Yellowstone, and there was a lot of conversation about what we can be doing to convey all kinds of different information. I mean, I think the challenge particularly for Yosemite and Yellowstone and like the big nature parks, is that they're so big, right? I mean, Yellowstone is enormous, right? And there are the two major loop roads. Kind of, where do you interface with visitors, right? And how many of those visitors are on foot? I mean, Chris, I think you get a lot of foot traffic where you are. And I think at the conference last year, they were saying at Yellowstone, something like 90% of visitors don't go beyond half a mile from their car, right? Like, so how do you actually engage with visitors? Where do you do it? How long do you have their attention? I mean, I'd love to see some kind of, I'm sure actually that there are some studies kind of being run on that. And what is the relative effectiveness of kind of like the storytelling that you do, Chris, with like leading an actual tour, and then also, museum sites or other kind of, built environments and architecture in park sites, and then out on the road, kind of either wayfinding or what's the specific term for like the informational?
Waysides.
Waysides. Thank you. I was like, wayfinding. I was like, I knew it was a way. So waysides, like, how do you use those? And we did have some conversations last year, some really productive ones, thinking about what it would be like to develop an app for each park that you could download on your phone when you are a visitor, or like maybe, you go through the gates and it pops up, I mean, that might be a little too big brother, but like it pops up to sort of say, like, do you want to download this app? And then it'll kind of ping you whenever you are driving past a site, right, where something happened, where some element of history, it could be indigenous history, it could be exploration or science, or and not only kind of thousands and thousands of year old history, but also, the history of the park after it becomes a park, right? That's still history, right? It doesn't stop. Right when the history of the park doesn't stop when it becomes a park, right? It continues and is ongoing. And I think there's a lot of potential there for technology to do a lot of this really interesting work in bringing this history to visitors in a way that allows them to kind of read or listen or watch something and kind of understand a little bit more about all of the complicated histories.
I'm going to take a step back a little bit and not address this visitor interface. I think one of the issues that really it has to start with is the National Park Service itself, and it's telling its own story. That the general understanding within the National Park Service is just about an inch deep on this subject. And if you look at fundamentals, some of the training programs that are going on that, every employee goes through, basically we still have, the National Park Service still has a rank and file workforce that if asked about the origin of national parks, it's fuzzy. It's, oh, well, Congress decided Yellowstone should be a national park in 1872. That's, that's still fairly entrenched. And until the National Park System, Park Service as an organization is able to reckon with this more complex and nuanced story that brings it back to the Civil War and Reconstruction, it's going to, if the organization itself is not able to absorb this and be able to have an internal conversation about it, it's certainly not going to be able to do much with the public. So I think there's still a lot of progress that could be made within the training community of the National Park System.
That's, kind of speaking as somebody who's getting ready to start training several new interpreters who are coming in. A lot of times, for those that aren't familiar, the way it often works is you get a new interpreter who comes in. You got sort of 2 weeks to sort of train them on everything from where the bathroom is to how to do your payroll to who to call when the toilet backs up to who to call when something goes off the rails to sort of visitor interface 101. And at a site like I've never worked at Yellowstone, but I would imagine that at a site like Yellowstone or Yosemite, trying to loop in sort of that early park history and tying it into broader issues has got to be a challenge. I do want to highlight, I guess, to kind of pivoting back to Yosemite pivot into Yosemite on this a little bit, and kind of get y'all's thoughts on this. With the Park Service, we take a longer view of Reconstruction. So Megan, I know earlier you kind of said, oh, in the 1890s after Reconstruction. Well, in the Park Service, we take that longer view of Reconstruction. We sort of call it up to about 1900 or so. So we sort of consider Yosemite to be a Reconstruction era park. And I know that they've got at least one or two interpreters on their staff, most famously Shelton Johnson, who was featured in the Ken Burns program, talking about the role of Buffalo Soldiers. Is sort of connecting into the park, sort of early park rangers, effectively. So what are some of y'all's thoughts on, at least work that you're already aware of that parks are doing? Because I know with Rolf, obviously you've worked in the Park Service for a long time. You're keenly aware of what all's going on at sites you've worked at. Adam and Megan, y'all have researched deeply into specific parks. I'm sure you visited many times. So kind of what are y'all's thoughts about what parks are kind of already doing? And then I've got then after y'all answer, we do have another question that I want to dive in here with.
Adam, why don't I hand it over to you?
Okay. it's been a while since I visited Yosemite, but I try to go to Yellowstone almost every summer. And, indigenous history is a much bigger theme in Yellowstone in recent years. And that's what my students noticed in 2021 when I took a group of college students. We drove out from Lynchburg to Yellowstone. I think there's a lot of challenges though, and it's, something I'll be working on as I transition into the MPS. When I teach in college or write in books, you're writing and teaching to a specific audience. With an MPS audience, you have, all sorts of ages, 6, 7-year-olds and all the way up to, their parents and grandparents, and they're all visiting. And so really engaging all that, that diverse audience at the same time, is a challenge. And so I think, using this, I'm going to obviously work on developing a lot of these skills myself, but, using multiple modes of interpretation, right? To how do you show to a 6-year-old that indigenous people lived in Yellowstone versus, giving a talk or, inviting, kind of encouraging tribal cooperation. So I think that's, a challenge and an opportunity for the parks these days. It is interesting though, there's still a lot of myths percolating out there, at my recent visit to Yellowstone in 2021, and this was not the MPS, but my students picked up a Jackson Hole magazine and it had a whole feature on the park's history that frankly just had a lot of factual inaccuracies. So, there's kind of still a lot of work, I think, with the general public. And that wasn't, again, not the park at all. But, I think the Campfire story is still out there. The idea that no one opposed the parks is still out there as well.
Just a footnote too, and some credit to your part, Chris, and to the wisdom of Congress. It was just a few years ago that there was legislation that went through to create a Reconstruction era network of national parks. In other words, realizing that the story is much bigger than Beaufort and the surrounding sites.
Yeah.
In fact, the story is told all over the country. And so I believe there are about 60 parks in the national park system that have signed up for this network, that have self-identified as telling part of this story. It's a huge story. Each have self-identified as being part of this larger family of sites. And I would assume that it will grow over time.
Yeah.
But the real challenge is how to use it effectively. And that's one of the powers of, I have to say, the most positive thing about the National Park Service is that it's a system. And if it works as a system, as functions as a system, if it interprets as a system, then its reach really can be unbounded. The potential is enormous. But I was thinking, Megan, that you were about to, if I didn't mean to interject at that moment, because this was obviously something that you've dealt with too, if you don't want to go there, you don't have to, but you're dealing with the myths associated with certain TV shows, recent TV.
Well, and I'm sure Mike can speak to this too, out there in the audience. Yeah, the extraordinary popularity of the show Yellowstone has just created like a completely insane kind of interest in the park, but one that is very, very specific. And most recently, Fox TV put out a Yellowstone documentary that was just, it was the worst of both worlds, because it was extremely historically accurate regarding some elements of Ferdinand Hayden's exploration, and then completely just not at all in other aspects of it. And so yeah, that made me completely insane. And I wrote a review of that for Slate, but I think it goes to a sort of larger point, which is that especially for the nation's nature parks, right? And the kind of the big national parks, which tend to suck up, those 63 parks tend to suck up most of the attention. But there are thousands of other parks, right? There are battlefield parks and historical parks and monuments and all that part of the National Park Service. And, I have almost weekly touch with multiple park sites around Massachusetts, right? Whereas it takes a special trip to get to Yellowstone. And so there are all these different sites, and they're all engaging with history in very different ways. And Yellowstone has, as Mike pointed out in the chat, in recent years, really done a much better job integrating indigenous history. They've been working really hard with the 27 tribal nations that are connected with Yellowstone to think about ways to convey that history. And part of their projects for the 150th got completely derailed by the flood. So this is another thing we need to talk about. Like, there are human threats kind of to national parks and their continuance, but there are also environmental threats. I mean, climate change is one of the most, it's the biggest, one of the biggest challenges, I think, facing national parks at this moment. And so, plans, particularly for the Apsalaki Nation's installation in Gardner, were delayed until August. They were supposed to launch that in May. And so, there are different problems that come up, I think, that prevent different forms of history and awareness from being implemented. But the park is doing, and I think kind of around the 150th, kind of took advantage of that moment to really start to integrate kind of new and more accurate indigenous histories into waysides and into, there's now a kind of center right at Old Faithful that is kind of showcasing indigenous history. And that's, probably the most visited site in Yellowstone, I would imagine. And so that's important to have that there, right? To have that as a central site. The extent to which Reconstruction history will be integrated, I still think is on the table, right? And I think there are all sorts of challenges to that, including the fact that Reconstruction history has been so de-emphasized until recently. It's sort of a period of time that often gets skipped over between the Civil War and Western expansion, and all of these things are kind of siloed in textbooks and in the way that colleges and universities structure their U.S. history surveys. It really de-emphasizes Reconstruction. And so your visitors may not have a sort of basic knowledge of even what Reconstruction was and is when they're entering a park that is not explicitly a Reconstruction park, right? And I'm sure, Chris, that you have faced this too with your visitor. Yeah.
Well, if I can kind of jump in here, because we do have a question that was asked a few minutes ago that and we'll probably end up ending with this. But real quick, Rolf, a moment ago, you mentioned the Reconstruction National Historic Network. That is something that was created by Congress through the John D. Dingell Act in 2019 that officially went live in 2020. And of note, parks did not necessarily self-select. Part of the way that was structured is Reconstruction National Historical Park kind of went down a list and said, which at the time was a staff of 2 people, me and the superintendent, and said, oh, that park's a Reconstruction Park, that park's a Reconstruction Park. Congratulations, you're all in the network. And then with COVID hitting and everything else, a lot of that notification didn't always percolate out. And so for Mike and the folks out at Yellowstone, surprise, you're in the Reconstruction National Historic Network. We've just advertised 2 park historian positions that just went live on USA Jobs today, whose part of their job will be to manage and support that network and make some of that notification out to parks and provide interpretive support and things like that. But what I want to circle back to is a question that was asked, and I think it ties really nicely into this theme, this idea of the campfire myth. So if we imagine a campfire as being a place where people are sitting around a campfire telling stories, well, who's not at that campfire, right? And I think if you're at Yosemite, we can look at people like Ranger Shelton Johnson, who's been trying to make sure that the Buffalo Soldiers, well, their stories being told. Parks are doing more work, like we've mentioned with Yellowstone, to make sure that indigenous stories or those perspectives are at the campfire. But we've got a question here about a group that has not been mentioned yet at all in this panel, kind of surprisingly. And that is, do women figure into this perspective of Yellowstone and Yosemite as Reconstruction sites? I'm thinking at least initially of women who are writing travel accounts of Western spaces. So I know that's sort of a loaded last question of the day to dive right back into the nitty gritty, but what role does gender and women's perspectives play in some of these early histories of Yellowstone and Yosemite specifically, but really any of these early national parks?
Yeah, I get this question a lot because everyone's like, Saving Yellowstone, full of dudes. And I'm like, yes. I was constantly kind of looking for women whose stories I could highlight. Of course, women were everywhere. They were supporting the exploration and preservation of Yellowstone in abundant different ways, kind of from beginning to end, right? But I was really hoping there would be like one woman, like a woman at the Smithsonian, or like like someone whose work I could highlight. And there just wasn't. And the fact of the matter was, in 1871 and 1872, exploration was a man's world. And very few women accompanied explorations from beginning to end. Sometimes wives went along for portions of it, but for the most part, yeah, all dudes. And then, Congress, all men. And so this is often the story of white men specifically, and what they wanted and what they wanted to do and how they are exerting their power. There are, of course, women everywhere across national parks. There are women working in national parks from the very early period, providing accounts, tourist accounts, photography. There's Mary Coulter and I think her last name is Coulter, at Grand Canyon, who is building, basically invents the kind of parkitecture movement of sort of how do we build spaces for visitors that engage with the landscape itself. And I think it just depends at certain sites, kind of where women's stories come in. And I know that NPS is funding fellowships and funding scholars to do work really highlighting, kind of really digging into and researching women's stories and highlighting them, particularly on NPS websites, and bringing their stories into that fuller understanding of national parks in general. As for Yellowstone, I think, again, it's like still a work in progress, as it is in a lot of other parks.
I just wanted to say that there were women travel writers to Yosemite who definitely contributed and participated in the national debate about what was happening there. There's a woman named Grace Greenwood. That was her pen name. Her actual name was Sarah Lippincott. And she wrote about the damage that she saw to Yosemite happening from a lack of state oversight. Specifically, she was talking to some workers who said, we're only using lumber that fell naturally. And she said, no, this had been cut down. So yes, there were women travel writers who, participated and had agency in the national debate about what was going on there.
And it's interesting, there are women who are in the larger context are hugely active in the abolition movement and women's suffrage, and are playing a particularly important political role in the United States leading up to the Civil War and beyond. We actually, Ethan Carr and I, in our book, Olmsted and Yosemite, we opened the book with an epigram, really a dedication. That was something that Sarah Blake Shaw wrote. She was a social activist, a very strong abolitionist, also the mother of Robert Gould Shaw, Colonel Robert Gould Shaw of 54th Massachusetts. And she wrote in a letter to Olmsted that we sort of frame our book around. She writes, if we can remake the government, abolish slavery, and get Central Park well underway for our descendants, we shall have done a work worthy of the 19th century. So she's, in a way, she's sort of sums up a lot of what we were talking about, this vision for the future. And she talks about Central Park, but she's really talking about parks as a writ large, as a movement of progress, as an example of progress. And, this would be a better country for all these things, and particularly the remaking of government in a way that it was no longer going to be a slave republic, but it was going to make room for public benefits like parks. So yes, there may not be these dominant female figures, but there's certainly people who add a lot of intellectual weight to the changes that we're all talking about today.
I think, and this may be kind of what we end up ending with, because I know we've kind of starting to hit the hour here, but, as we started talking about women, the comment, the chat box started lighting up a little bit with, well, how do we talk about more diverse groups? How do we reach more diverse groups? Hispanic groups were brought up specifically. And one of the things that we try to do here at Reconstruction Era National Historical Park is, our park's sort of core local audience or core local sort of story are the descendants of Gullah Geechee people who lived here on the Sea Islands. And one of our core resources on that, when we don't have those written experiences, is sort of an oral history tradition. Share with us your family story so that we can incorporate that. And as we think about places like Yellowstone, Yosemite, or even national parks that were established later. I spent last summer at Guadalupe Mountains, talking to, members of, and I know Yellowstone, for example, has certainly been doing this, talking to members of the Shoshone, the Nez Perce, and, what are some of those oral history traditions? Because certainly women were experiencing these national parks before any white explorer, in air quotes, there passed through there, right? So, I think that, engaging with your park's local community, both in its present form, but also in who was there in the past, and talking to those communities and what stories do they want shared is an important way we can talk about what's happening during Reconstruction, and to amplify stories that maybe don't always appear in the archival record, or maybe who were systematically excluded. Like, certainly Dr. Hayden wasn't hauling a whole bunch of women with him on the expedition, but the landscape he was going into, he was effectively uprooting women's homes. So how do we I think those are angles we can sort of explore a little bit with some of this as well. So I know that was sort of an abrupt sort of conclusion, I guess, but real quick before we sort of dismiss everybody, because I know we've hit the hour. I see Dave is sort of chiming back in. So Dave, I'm going to hand it back off to you in case you've got any final words or threats or anything else that you need to shout at us.
No, I just want to say in wrapping up, to first of all, thank all of you, our panelists, and you, Chris, as the moderator. So Megan, Adam, Rolf, this was very stimulating. And, we had several comments and questions we were unable to get to in the chat surrounding things like the future of the Antiquities Act, inclusivity, things like that. I just wanted to say the kind of scholarship that you guys are marshaling and that you're also using right there at Reconstruction Era, Chris, that's what's going to move the conversation forward, so we can tackle these much larger questions about the future of conservation in the country, and how these things play out, the kinds of things that were in the chat. So thanks to all of you for this wonderful presentation. To me, this is like an ideal webinar. It was a great conversation. I want to thank everybody in the audience for being with us this hour. And for putting the stuff into the chat and having your questions. The webinar is being recorded, has been recorded. We will post it to the George Wright Society YouTube channel, where it will be available to anybody, and anytime you want to go take a look, or if you have colleagues who missed it. So put that on there. Everybody who registered, you'll get an email from me letting you know when that's up and ready. We have to edit it first, and we'll do that. And so just want to close with thanking you all, and also just to say, as the executive director of the George Wright Society, I would be remiss in my duties if I didn't offer you cordially the opportunity to support our organization, because we do rely on the support of the George Wright community to be able to bring these things to you. So if you're so inclined, you can donate to us at our website, georgewrightsociety.org, and that would be wonderful if you can do that. But anyway, thank you all. We'll bring it to a close with that, and hope to see you at a future webinar. So again, thanks everybody, and have a good rest of your day. Bye-bye.
Thanks everyone. Thanks for coming.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dave.
Thank you.